In Bangladesh, a fire swept through a sprawling Rohingya refugee camp on Monday, killing at least 5 people. It destroyed homes and endangered the lives of tens of thousands of refugees, destroyed specifically at least 3,000 shelters, and marks the largest of multiple fires that have plagued the camp this year alone. The number of Rohingya refugees estimated to live in the region, in the vicinity of that camp, and in the camp itself, are an estimated 800,000 to more than 900,000. Most have fled from persecution in Myanmar over the last half decade and more. Myanmar denies the genocide accusation and has maintained that the clearance operations by the military were legitimate counterterrorism measures. In Israel, nearly 90% of the votes were counted on Wednesday, a day after the country went to polls to elect a new parliament, but there has been no clear winner. The deadlock, however, has left Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a characteristic position of marginal strength. He's still scrambling to recruit support from enough small special interest parties to give his own party a parliamentary majority, but he has the lead, as is the norm with Israeli elections recently. He is due back in court, by the way, in April for a trial on fraud and bribery. Multiple charges, multiple cases. That trial was put on hold while the election took place. And again, we'll be resuming this next month. And a year later than expected, Japan has finally kicked off its Olympic torch relay. Athletes will now carry the flame across all of the country to arrive in Tokyo for the opening ceremony on the 23rd of July. I'm going to say, Japan is a relatively small country. They're probably going to do like a lot of traverses. They're going to get to pretty much everywhere in that country, because how many months are we out from July? Almost 4 months now. It takes a while, and there's not that much to run. I know somebody who's looked into like walking across countries for random reasons that nobody should ever ask me about. I'm just curious about this stuff. And Japan is a relatively small one. Anyway, into tech news for a minute. The World Economic Forum is convening the first Global Technology Governance Summit on the 6th to the 7th of April 2021. This virtual meeting, hosted by Japan, is organized in close collaboration with the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network, comprising more than 40 governments and international organizations, as well as 15 companies. New technologies will be presented, such as the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, to build back better. Those are neither new technologies, nor, in my opinion, are they actually particularly exciting. Artificial intelligence, okay, there's definitely some exciting and even scary advancements there over the past, say, decade. Things have accelerated recently with the advent of deep learning and GPUs being, both repurposed and newly created, complex processing units being created by Google and other companies to speed this stuff up. But I don't know. The Internet of Things is kind of old and played out, in my opinion. Not that much has happened with it, frankly. But apparently, these will be the center of the next sort of industrial wave, the next civilizational revolution happening on a technological and economic scale, according to Klaus Schwab, at least, who's pushing this idea very strongly, also the head of the World Economic Forum. We'll be coming back to that. Kind of an interesting topic, in my opinion. But hey, to keep their jobs, this is the next headline, to keep their jobs, Amazon's delivery drivers are required to consent to biometric monitoring. The monitoring comes from cameras in their vehicles, which will take their photos and track their driving for unsafe behaviors. Amazon spokesperson Deborah Bass said the camera program is meant solely as a safety measure. Okay, all right, there you go. A group of 5 U.S. senators previously expressed concern over the video monitoring, asking Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos in an open letter to explain how the company will avoid violating workers' privacy and putting them at risk by adding unsafe pressure to their already fast-paced jobs. Critics have said the pace of the job is unmanageable, with drivers expected to deliver hundreds of packages in a 10-hour shift. Some drivers have reported not having time to find a bathroom. The cameras will monitor for drivers who urinate or defecate outdoors. But can it tell whether they're urinating or defecating indoors while they're seated? I don't know.
Amazon doesn't
I'll
care.
have to install more sensors for that.
Amazon doesn't care, man. They don't care.
Those
Amazon, because from
are their
Amazon,
trucks.
well, from Amazon's standpoint, that worker doesn't have any privacy when he's on the job. I would wager they don't. And by the way, when they're in the factory and they're wearing those little monitors, apparently at some point, and I think it was reported, that keeps track of their movements and stuff. I mean, even the bathroom breaks and all are being measured, because in their heads, we need these people to be robots. And if they're robots, we can track how many boxes they ship. We can track the amount of time they do it in. We can, meaning the moment that you get those metrics, you can try to make those metrics better to speed up the amount of time. Even if you can shave off, let's say, 2 seconds off of the way the person acts. What does that look like over the course of a year or 10 years? And how does that measure in regards to the amount of money that's saved? Does it make sense? Like in their heads, they want robots. And this is kind of what I'm telling the public. They're searching for those robots. Those human beings will be replaced the moment that they can find a way to replace them. What do you thought, Shane?
And I mean, here's another thing. Pardon me. Jeez. Oh, man. This is over a century old. Like, if you go back and look at Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was known for creating scientific efficiency, the scientific efficiency movement, basically making industry, making factories more effective, streamlining the lives of workers, regimenting them in such ways that, suit the interests of productivity, that suit the interests of the owners of those companies, and not so much the personal lives or concerns or habits of the employers. That way of looking at things is, it's older than that, but that was a moniker for it, and certainly was an advance in those techniques. That's an old technique at this point. And it's a constant one that we're having to live through. In pretty much any industry where there's a bottom line and there are people working to meet that bottom line, then, over time, the employers are going to try to make it more effective, and they're going to be the ones that are more effective by definition. And so they're going to sort of winnow out and beat out the ones who aren't as effective. And it's just this long, complicated process. But I guess my point is, this is nothing new. It is more personal and it's more invasive because you didn't have either cars or advanced in-car monitoring techniques back in the late 1900s. But, it's the same principle effectively, I guess is my point. But you know what? We've got to go to a break. Those are our headlines. We didn't even get to the one about how penises are smaller these days. There are more headlines we could have got to, and that was probably the most important one for men and women around the globe. But
more so for women. I think more so for women. But let's keep going. That's right.
Hey, you ask men about that, and they'll be like, "Dude, what are you talking about? This is my very identity. This is the foundation of who I am." No, I'm just kidding. But maybe not for some. Anyway, we got to go to a break. You guys are listening to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with our next guest, Garland Nixon, in a minute on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also reach us with a tweet, a chat, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We have had a conversation on this show about the upcoming press conference, and we've also had a conversation on the show about guns. And I want to get into a larger conversation about this. I think I've made the point before that I have become somewhat jaded about this issue. When I first started doing my show about 4 or 5 years ago, I used to get very angry about the gun issue. I used to puff my chest, bloviate, flail wildly, according to my wife, about how unseemly it is, to put it mildly, that a civilization or a population would allow mass deaths nearly daily, meaning mass shootings. But on top of that, situations where people, for whatever particular reason, inspired by whatever particular idea in the culture, goes out and decides that it is my job or it is the necessity to murder and mow down large numbers of people at once. You would think that at the shootings at schools, that would be enough. Nope. You would think that at the nightclub, that would be enough. Nope. And you would think, even now, with the number of people that just got mowed down back to back like this in the recent 2 mass killings, that that would be enough. And I don't believe it will be, which is why I don't invest a huge amount of emotion, energy, or otherwise into dealing with the subject, because I don't believe for once that the American public cares enough about the subject to do and push their political leaders to do anything about it. Nor do I believe, honestly, even with Democrats in the House and the Senate, that they are going to take aggressive action towards it. I could be wrong, but considering Joe Biden wasn't even willing to fight for the $15 an hour minimum wage, something that he promised on the campaign trail, why should I believe in this? Joining us, we're joined by Garland Nixon. Garland is a Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Garland, and as you know, Garland, previous runners of the show, fought lines with Lee and Stranahan at one point. Garland, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me back, guys. Great to talk to you again.
Absolutely. So I want to get into the press conference, for one, but I also want to talk about guns. You were a former policeman, and it's not so much a one-to-one in this context, but I thought you may have an interesting context or interesting commentary about it. The number of people that are being shot on a daily basis, for one, the number of people that are shot in these kind of mass killings, be it 10, 20, 30, ungodly numbers of people at once, and with our political leaders who turn into theologians and tell people to send prayers, because real policy and trying to get to not even the spiritual root of it, but just trying to cut down on the number of times that it happens seems to be out of reach. How do you frame this from your perspective before we get into the issue of the press conference? What are your thoughts about, A, this from the perspective of a policeman when you were in that job? Because you yourself could have been shot, or somebody who you were with could have been shot with all of those guns that are rummaging around the streets and the people with the bad intentions associated with those guns, and a culture that doesn't necessarily even deal with why the bad intentions exist in the first place or why the number of killings in the first place. You were on the front lines of that. But also as somebody who's now dealing with the political angle of that and the way that there seems to be an entire indelible intransigence on getting anything done on that issue. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me start here, just purely from the perspective of when I was a law enforcement officer. Guns can be a big problem for a police officer, and I mean it's absolutely obvious. Let me give you an example. Let's say I get a call that a alarm has gone off at a home, a burglar alarm. You know, somebody has their plain old, whatever burglar alarm at their home. The alarm goes off, and I respond. A couple of cops respond. Meanwhile, 2 or 3 neighbors take out their AK-47s, guns, etc., and they respond. When the officer gets there, I see guys with guns. Is this the guy that broke in? Is this a murderer? Are these just, you see the problem? So as a police officer, when you respond to a scene and there's a bunch of people with guns, number one, you can't just shoot everybody there. Well, you shouldn't. Number two, if one of those guys happens to be the murderer, you get shot because you have no idea what's happening. So that's the first thing. I mean, just purely from a law enforcement perspective, when you respond to anything and everybody has a gun, you're kind of completely left hanging, and it's a pretty horrifying scenario. I don't know the answer to it. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that's an issue as law enforcement. From a political perspective, and I'm kind of like you, I've gotten to this point where this is the way I see it. America has decided that they've weighed the interest. On the one hand, the interest to completely do away with all gun legislation, because that's a move that there are people that are moving to do that. You know, a total push against any gun safety laws, any gun legislation at all. Gun laws can't be nuanced. It's either they're going to take them all, or you can have them, one of the two. So I think the issue is America has sadly, maybe not intentionally, made a decision. We'd rather continue to have these types of massacres and things of that nature than have any gun safety laws or regulations. That, you know, so and it boils down to this: gun laws and legislation cannot be nuanced in the United States. The people who oppose any gun safety laws or gun laws at all have dominated the conversation, and they've turned it into either they're going to take all our guns and we have none, or we can stay with what we have now. And that's where we are. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. We're just going to continue to pay the price as long as we feel that way.
And it serves as a political football over the years, and it also serves as a distraction. And as I noted earlier in the show, I'm just going to point this out too. We still have a migrant crisis at the southern border, and that was the predominant news story for about a week in Western media, in the U.S. media, and for in my opinion, legitimate reasons. I'm not trying to completely discount the cause here. This story has come back. It's reared its head again, and people are having these conversations again. And it feels like we're caught in a sort of perpetual deja vu on this, along with so many other, important issues that nevertheless never seem to get resolved. And where the conversations often go, and where they usually sort of stop when they go there, is what is the root cause here? If you had a functional, peaceful society where on the deepest level people did not want to kill other people in random or coordinated acts of violence, you wouldn't have this problem. And whether you had more guns or less guns, at least on the topic of mass shootings, this would not be nearly as much of an issue. You'd still have the problem that you were talking about, where you reporting to the scene of a crime don't know how to respond to that, because you don't know exactly who did what. And if you see multiple people with guns on the scene, you're left scratching your head. You're left a bit hamstrung, knowing exactly who you should be responding to. That's sort of another question. It's its own problem, but usually where the conversation ends when we're talking about gun control generally, or gun rights, is, well, if you didn't have people doing these things, then it wouldn't be as much of an issue. And I agree with it, but it seems to stop there. And where it should go from that point is, what can we do about it? What are actually the root causes here? How old are they? Where do they come from? Why are kids and people randomly killing other kids and people on what seems to be a pretty constant basis here in the States? Do you have any perspective on that, Garland? Do you have a pin, at least in your mind, on what's causing that, how we can help it? That set of questions.
Sure. And I'm a big believer in this. There's something that we cannot talk about in America when it comes to guns, and that is the relationship between foreign policy, between our militaristic foreign policy, and violence at home. I've always put it to you like this. If you've got a guy who goes out, he gets in a fight in bars and he beats somebody up. He gets in, on the way home, he gets in an argument, gets in a fight in a grocery store. He gets caught at the red light. He gets in a fight with the guy next to him in a car because he's of road rage. When he gets home, you know what he's going to do? He's going to beat the crap out of his wife and kids. Why? Because the same thing he does out away from home is what he's going to do. You're never going to find a guy who has, or a person, I'm just saying guy, who has a problem with violence and a history of violence in the street, but they come home and they're nice and gentle. The only difference between domestic policy and foreign policy is grammatical. Barack Obama yesterday is out there talking about all these guns. Here's a guy who shipped tons and tons and tons of weapons through Operation Timber Sycamore into Syria. So here, from one perspective, Barack Obama says we don't want guns in our society, but we're going to ship literally tons, hundreds of thousands of weapons into other societies. And the contradiction is not discussed. I don't believe that contradiction is a benign contradiction. I believe that it is very much relevant, and that it's like the parent standing there with a big bottle of whiskey in his hand saying to his son, whatever you do, son, don't ever drink. Well, you know what? Kids don't listen. They watch and learn. And I believe the same thing for the American people. And as long as we're doing that in the streets, and it only makes sense that it would happen here. But that's part of the discussion that you can't have in an empire, because that would discuss the reality of what our empire does and the true violence behind American foreign policy.
You're looking at it in terms of our foreign policy. I think that applies. I think there's also, domestic policy, whether you're talking about the economy or the constant infighting politically that, through the culture war and through the sort of regional division, these regional divisions that you see across the country, there are all of these conflict lines. There are all these fault lines that people are constantly killing each other over, no pun intended. We need to go to a break. We're going to be coming back with Garland Nixon on the other side of this short break. He's a Sputnik political analyst and the host and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, a show airing here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Go check it out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking Biden's first press conference. This is a bit delayed, admittedly, more than 2 months into his administration. If I remember correctly, it was about 27 days before Trump had held his first press conference, about 20 days before Obama's first press conference, and then about 33 days before George H.W. Bush's first press conference. And yet Biden has taken a long time. Biden has taken multiple months here. And apparently has been held back, as we've covered, from taking questions from the press. And the question, of course, I would ask is why? Anyway, to have this conversation, to talk about what's coming up later this afternoon, we are joined by Garland Nixon. He is a Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That show airs here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. And by the way, while I'm on it, you can and you should follow Garland on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. Just do a search for Garland Nixon, and you'll find him. Garland, Biden's first press conference happening later today. What do you think about it taking this long, and what do you think is going to happen?
Enough. I don't think. Well, I'll speak for me, but I don't think a lot of people will be as concerned with the content as they will with the presentation. The discussion is why is it so long? But what's behind the discussion? Well, Joe Biden has had some issues with mental acuity over the last year that have been pronounced and obvious. And let's face it, in his dust up with Vladimir Putin threw some elbows, basically pointing directly at that, saying, hey, look, why don't we have a little face-to-face here online, and but it's got to be live, again, implying that, dude, you can't do live. So I think more, if you've been looking at U.S. policy, if you've been watching Joe Biden, it's not hard to predict on the various issues where he's going to go on these issues. I think it's fairly obvious. But the question is, will he be able to, how well he'll be able to put them forth? I think that, interestingly enough, I think that's the issue. And I don't think it's just in the U.S. I think worldwide, because those who hit the adversaries of Joe Biden, I'm not going to necessarily say the U.S., because the adversaries of the neocons are not the adversaries of the citizens of the United States, are all going to be looking. And I think there's going to be a lot of people waiting to pounce on the first stutter he makes, or the first time he calls Kamala Harris, President Harris, or something like that. That will be the lead line in everywhere except the New York Times and the Washington Post, which will say, boy, a fantastic job he's done, and we're glad Trump's gone so Biden can stumble through press conferences and pretty much institute the same policies around the world.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think it's the same thing. I think nobody has, I don't think there's a mystery in regards to the foreign policy or the policies that Biden are going to be putting out. I think the catch is this is a criticism, or this is a analysis of him as an individual, his role in that office, and whether or not he is physically up to the stature of taking that office. I totally agree with you on that. And you're right, Vladimir Putin basically challenging to a debate because he knew Joe Biden couldn't stand up to a debate. I mean, for God's sake, even against Donald Trump, he is a wisp of who he was. And whatever you think about Joe Biden, look at him 10 years ago when he was having the debate, when he was Obama's vice president, and he was having a debate with Palin, or he was having a debate with, there was another gentleman that he had a debate with, Paul Ryan. It's a different man. And look, that's not me taking shots at him on that. I'm just saying, as a flat fact, objective reality, looking at him, he is fundamentally different. And the speech, more important than the speech, I agree with you, is him himself. and what he's going to put it. I'm curious from the standpoint of media. Do you think that they're going to ask him difficult questions on this? Meaning, is he going to get the questions on immigration and about U.S. policy abroad and how that's inspiring this level of immigration, either with drug laws, either with drug policy, or for that matter, toppling the governments? Do you think he's going to get hit with the questions on foreign policy in general, about pulling out of Afghanistan on a deadline, or about Iraq basically wanting the U.S. to get lost and us still saying, well, we're just here to help? Like, do you think he's going to get these harder questions, or you think, no, it really is going to be, we're glad that Trump is gone, and so however we ask the question is going to be with a velvet cotton lace glove in the way they're going to be put forward? What are your thoughts?
I'll go one further than that. I think it's, it would be bad if they, went with, velvet gloves as opposed to an iron fist. But I think it's worse than that. Based on what I saw with the Stephanopoulos, I think that was at minimum coordinated with the Biden team, between the Biden team and the media outlets, and at minimum coordinated, at maximum rehearsed. So I also feel, based on what I saw leading into the 2020, the November election, where the mainstream media and the social media companies ran interference for him. They were enforcers for any narrative that the Biden team wanted to put forward. I would suspect that the questions will be coordinated, and that, and think about it. We found out that Hillary Clinton, we found out that she was getting questions from CNN during the debates, prior to the debates with Bernie. So we already know there's media coordination. So I would suspect there's going to be heavy coordination, and that his allies in the media are going to do everything they can to ensure that he is successful, that he knows what's happening, that he's practiced, and he still might screw it up.
Agreed. 100% agreed. Even with a teleprompter, I'm not sure that's what he would be reading from, but even with that, I could see him screwing up wildly depending on depending on what question he's asked, where his mind goes, that kind of thing. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to turn to another topic here. Thank you for speaking with us about that one. We're going to be watching that, of course. Foreign policy. I want to talk about China for a minute. We've been covering this a lot after the meeting this past Friday and Saturday between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and China's top diplomat, I believe it's Yang Jiechi, talking about American influence and the extent of it and where it stands right now in the relationship between China and the United States. And two bits of context that I want to drop in here. For one thing, it was just a few short months ago that on Trump's way out, his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, accused China of committing a long-term genocide with their Uyghur population. And then a few short weeks later, again, just a couple months ago, new Secretary of State Blinken, who again was the most prominent American diplomat at this meeting, a few weeks after Mike Pompeo said that, Antony Blinken signed on to that. So both the past and the current administration have accused China of committing a genocide. I can't help but to think that is near the top of Jiechi's mind as he's having that meeting with Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Secondarily, another big factor here, if you do a compare and contrast between China's COVID response and America's COVID response in terms of these high-level proofs of competency by different governments, despite being the purported, the widely assumed origin of the coronavirus, China handled it much more competently, effectively nipping it in the bud, having long periods with no community transmission, much lower cases overall than other countries, despite the fact that China has, the world's largest population, despite that they are such a massive country. They also responded to it much more effectively. And it's not just China and the United States that can see that. It's also, of course, the rest of the world. So with those two key factors in mind, I think that China is feeling like it has both a cause to represent, it's feeling like it has the wind at its back, and it's feeling like America is getting way too bellicose for the circumstances. And Jiechi, during the meeting, responded to the United States, effectively telling them to back off, telling them, you're not in charge of the relationship here anymore. We're on an equal ground, and you can't dictate to us what that relationship is going to be from a position of strength. That's an almost direct quote from him. How do you see this relationship, Garland?
Well, interestingly enough, I think last week was one of the turning points, one of the most important weeks internationally, probably, if not the most important week in international relations so far in this century, in that the verbal insults of Putin against Putin and against President Putin and the Alaska meeting, I think, demonstrated to Russia and China. I think they were trying to avoid a strong strategic alliance. I think they looked at it and said, we don't want a bipolar world. If the two of us come together, then the U.S. will argue, okay, it's kind of like, the old Warsaw Pact. It's the NATO versus them. But I think they came to realize that they had no other option but to unite. If you I go to globaltimes.cn a lot. I go to TASS, so I can see what information's coming out of Russia and China. I love press TV for Iran. I always try to go to the English version of various countries to see what's coming out of them. And here's what you see: the Russia and China have built a very strong, as they refer to it, a strategic alliance. I think there is a strong unity there, and basically and if you just read a lot of the op-eds and stuff at Global Times, you'll see that they have united. They seem to me, in my opinion, they're building somewhat of an anti-imperialist bloc that's going to include, Iran, Venezuela, a number of other countries. So I think they've come to the conclusion that they can no longer sit back and see the U.S. as an irritant and kind of wait to see what happens. They have to assertively oppose the imperialist nature of the U.S. empire. Interestingly enough, I'm keeping an eye on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline issue in Germany, because not only is the U.S. Challenging the national sovereignty of China and Russia and a lot of other countries. Interestingly enough, a alleged ally of Germany, the U.S. is challenging their national sovereignty also, and Germany has to make a decision as to whether they are one of the poles, one of the political, economic, military poles in a multipolar world, or whether they are just a vassal state in the vast empire of the U.S. So the U.S. is pushing this empire thing, and I think they're going to force Germany to push back, and we'll see the results of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I think that's huge, and I think the U.S. also knows if the Nord Stream 2 pipeline gets done, it just makes it all the harder for them to push that the Russians are about to come through the Balkans and take us, and take Europe all out, when in fact what the Russians really want is economic partnership with EU nations.
Yeah, that's.
And very quick, I just want to make two very quick comments here, and Jamarl, I'm going to pass it to you. But one, as we talked about earlier on with Mark Sloboda, the United States is a big importer of Russian crude. So despite all of the arguments on the surface, it's weird how behind the scenes we still have trade relationships with this country, despite us sanctioning them constantly these days. We still have that long relationship. And point number two, a few weeks ago, actually I believe it was last week, in a 48-hour period, we sanctioned not only Russia and China, but also Germany and India, which, of course, even though they have longstanding disputes with China over Kashmir, even though there are these, constant ongoing tensions, also close to them regionally. And in terms of breaking away these countries on the periphery of this Eurasian bloc, this power bloc that you're talking about, Garland, with Russia and with China, I can see us wearing our allies to the bone and forcing them to seek other partnerships increasingly, as we're inconsistent, as we're sclerotic, all that. Jamarl, though, you were coming in there. What were you going to say?
Well, yeah, I was just going to, on some level, back up something that Garland was saying. In the old days, we used to call the Department of Defense the Department of War. That was far more honest in regards to what it did and what its job was. Well, I think in the same way that we've kind of moderated the language in this kind of propagandistic way, we're not going to call it war, we're going to call it defense. We're defending ourselves as we, bash you in your country, meaning, nobody's attacking Oklahoma. We're in Syria, we're in Iraq, we're in these other countries. But in the same way, it's not called the Department of Defense, the Department of War. I think allies is the same thing. I think what the allies need to realize is that they're vassals. And insofar as they work with our interests, everything is fine. We can accept that term of ally. We're totally working together as long as you're doing exactly what we want you to do. But the moment that you deviate from it, that's when the reality of it gets shown, that it's not an ally, it's a vassal. We are basically telling Germany that they themselves cannot make a choice that is in their national interests because we don't like it. That is astonishing. I mean, that really is astonishing. And the media and everything else just kind of asks this question as if it's America's purview to do that. It's not. That's a change. And so, yeah, I'm curious if Biden is going to get asked those questions. He's probably not. And on a foreign policy standpoint, yeah, Garland, yeah, same thing. I've been really paying attention. And in the press conference, Psaki is asked this question constantly. And her answer is always the same. Well, we think it's a bad deal. We think it's a bad deal. We have nothing to, what is it? She doesn't say present. We have nothing to something that she gives. It's a weird word that she uses to talk about what she has to display. Garland, thank you for joining us, man. I really do appreciate it. The voice.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Absolutely. The voice that you guys were listening to is Garland Nixon. He is a Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. You can also search Garland. You can find him on YouTube, but you can also find his work on Twitter and on Facebook. And on Twitter, it's at Garland Nixon. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the wrap.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're in our wrap segment for today's show. That means we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Another good show so far, I'll say. Interesting conversations, and it was great to have Taylor Hudak to start us off very early on in the show, giving us live coverage, basically, of the trial of Craig Murray, which is important. I mean, that's, in some sense, that's a local political issue for the UK. But in another sense, like she was saying, it's an assault on free speech and a continuation of what is legitimately quite a big deal in Scottish politics. Now, I'll put it like this. If this hadn't been brought against Alex Salmond, if it's not just if he were acquitted, it's not just being cleared of public charges, all that stuff. If this had never happened in the first place, he would undoubtedly be a bigger player in Scottish politics and possibly the dominant player. He would possibly be the player as head of state for Scotland. And if that were the case, all of a sudden you'd face a very realistic prospect of Scotland seeking independence, which on a sort of, grand geopolitical level, looking at the tectonic plates of the world states, that would be a massive shakeup. That would be a huge breakdown in the status quo, the way things are going, and a very curious set of circumstances for the EU as they'd have to figure out how they responded to it. Not to mention England, Britain, having to respond to a more politically fractured Great Britain. So great way to start the show. We went on, just giving people a brief wrap up. And again, we're taking your calls, 202-521-13. Started off 7:30 with Taylor Hudak, spoke with her for 15 minutes. At 8:15, we spoke with Mark Sloboda about Russian oil imports in Nord Stream 2. At 8:30, we spoke with Miko Peled about the Israeli election results and Benjamin Netanyahu's continued longevity as a political player. And we just finished up a conversation with Garland Nixon starting at 9:15, ending at about 9:46, just a minute ago, talking about gun control, talking about Biden's press conference, talking about foreign policy. Interesting conversation indeed. And again, we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. We've got James calling in from California. James, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
Two things. One, yesterday while watching the Hawks, they mentioned that we had a 37% increase in gun sales fraud. And I wondered if you guys knew about, when I did my taxes, they asked me if I bought any cryptocurrency. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that were, too. All right, guys.
James, thank you for the call. I'll be honest, I have not bought any cryptocurrency. I was following Bitcoin way back in like 2013, and I don't think anybody, I did have somebody personally recommend that I buy some because they went in knee deep, and I'm sure, assuming they haven't sold somewhere along the way, they're like a multi-millionaire at this point because, it was like worth pennies back then, basically. And now it's worth, $50,000. It's been a little while since I've checked, but multiple, not too far, but yeah, it's $51,000, 751 per Bitcoin. And if you had hundreds of those, well, you can do the math. That's a lot of money all of a sudden. I have not personally bought into it though.
So
Jamarl,
I haven't bought Bitcoin. I have an account with Rothkin, and Rothkin uses cryptocurrency, and I think they use what, Elysium or something to that effect that could be transferred into something that can be used, that could be converted to cash. The IRS is probably asking that because they're probably saying, "Do you have any dark money? Do you have any money that we can't trace? We need you to be own up to it." And therein lies the problem, I think, with cryptocurrency. My thing was always the government is never going to allow secondary forms of currency because secondary forms of currency challenges the real power of the U.S. Meaning a government's power, in part, to dispense force, that's one aspect of it, but also currency. The fact that they are the issuers of that currency. And if you want to do anything, you have to go through the currency to which they issue, they control, they have all of the pipelines dealing with. And even from the pipelines from around the world when they're using it, that's one of the powers of the government. So I didn't believe for a moment they were going to allow this kind of black budget way of engaging. I'm surprised they even allowed it to get to the point that they've allowed it to get to. But that's probably why they're asking that question. Beyond that, I didn't buy into cryptocurrency because, like I said, I was skeptical of it. But it's flourishing. So who knows?
It is. I mean, and I will admit, I didn't respond directly to your question there, James. I was talking about whether or not I bought it. You were talking about the tax treatment, the IRS looking into people's possession of it. And like Jamarl's saying, this is sort of one of the deeper problems. As Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies seek legitimacy, at least as they seek wide use and therefore legitimacy, they're going to come under increasing scrutiny from the federal government. The more money you have in Bitcoins, the more of that money the tax authorities are going to want access to. And of course, that's the fundamental problem. I don't see, for all the people who are talking about Bitcoin as an alternative, as a genuine, deep alternative to the currency regime that the world is operating in right now, I don't see how you get around it. And what you see instead, increasingly, are companies and states wanting to either create their own cryptocurrencies as it suits their interest, or to tap into the currencies that exist. And the more that you do that, the more that you have that integration with the existing economic system, the harder and harder it seems to me to be to have some alternative to it. Instead, you just have a sort of augmentation and addition to what currently exists. Here's another interesting little tidbit and another maybe an example of this process. Back in the early days of PayPal, like the tech company and payment transfer system PayPal, they had a kind of similar goal. If you look at what they wanted, they talk about this. They were trying to create an alternative to the U.S. dollar and to currencies in the way that we use them and think of them now, trying to create a purely internet-based currency. Just interesting to note that they themselves, instead of continuing to pursue that goal originally, they exchanged it out for basically serving to transact and carry existing money from one party to another. It's the same trajectory. I'm not saying cryptocurrency is going to go that way. And for a lot of people who watch the cryptocurrency space, what's exciting about it are not the coins themselves. It's the blockchain technology that they're built upon, which has its own weight, has its own potential, and exists sort of as its own thing. And I don't want to completely dismiss that. They're not the same thing, but because they're tied so deeply together, you treat them as if they were. We're taking your calls, and we're taking more calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. We've got another caller on the line. Let's go to Skip calling in from DC. Skip, you're on. What's going on?
Hey, guys. I wanted to chime in about the mass shootings and agree with you guys about looking at it in terms of the real bigger picture and the systemic issues. And, there are so many layers to that. But one thing, and I think it might have even been Garland last night on his show, and I'm surprised it didn't come up, but one thing to really emphasize, in my opinion, if I wanted to get on my soapbox, is the mental health aspect of it, and specifically pharmaceuticals and that kind of thing, because if you do just quick searches, you'll come up with a lot of papers and a lot of really weighted research in terms of the correlation, and it's really stark. Whether people were just starting a new medication, getting off of a medication, or changing their dose of some kind, is about a 90% correlation between the mass shootings.
Interesting. Is it just that the person was mentally ill, though? I mean, I guess what you're saying, like, I get it, the mental ill aspect. I always feel like the mentally ill aspect always gets pushed up. Am I wrong on that? Like, Shane, what do you think? Like, I always think that it's easier to say, oh, people were mentally ill, as opposed to what are the factors in your culture, in your world that is incentivizing that individual to take that gun and believe he needs to eliminate the lives of X number of people. Like,
or to be mentally ill in the first place. I mean, admittedly, people will, and this comes up pretty much whenever you have a mass shooting that gets mass media coverage. People will bring up charges of mental illness. Other people will say that you are using that to dismiss the crimes and the deeper systemic problems. But mental illness is itself a symptom. Mental illness, whether it's merely alleged, whether it's improperly diagnosed. In other words, whether there's a there on a deep, deep psychological level, materially, neurologically, or whether it's just a psychiatrist coming in to diagnose some form of human aberrant behavior, whatever, in their eyes. There is a problem that is being described there, and that problem is itself due to deeper systemic problems. So I actually don't see it as an evasion. It's just sort of shifting the focus of it slightly. It's using the word mental illness as if that explains away something when really it doesn't. It just is a sort of shortcut to another description of human behavior. That might be too in the weeds for some people.
No. That's dead on. I think that's dead on. Because think about what we're saying for the moment. It's calling it mental illness makes it looks as if it's understood. We got it under wraps. Like, just because you describe it doesn't necessarily mean it's understood or you have it under wraps. And if you're categorizing something as mental illness when that illness was generated from the society itself, then you're not explaining anything. At that point, you're covering it.
And on the subject of the drugs, which is actually what you brought up, Skip, when you called in, how people were either coming on or going off of drugs. I know people who have benefited specifically from antidepressants and from other, pharmaceuticals that are prescribed to them for medical illnesses or whatever term you want. I don't even know if ADHD, I guess technically is considered a mental illness, but that's usually not what people mean. And when I say technically, I don't even know. But, I know people, whether it's ADHD or depression or anxiety disorders, who have taken these drugs with some good effect. I personally always steered away from them, and I haven't really had anything that I needed to treat with them. So maybe I'd be in a different boat if I were. But that is itself potentially a problem. And it does strike me, I'm going to look more into this, and thank you for bringing it up, that it's when people are going on to or coming off of these drugs that they're doing these things. That makes sense. And that itself is a pretty darn important problem. It's something we should know about, something we should be talking about. Thank you for bringing that up. If that's true, and I just want to verify that for myself, that is a big deal. And I don't know what that means in terms of public policy or health policy or how we cover these things, how the mass media should be covering these things. But that's significant. Any take on that, Jamarl? We're almost out of time here.
Yeah, that is significant. I mean, if it's literally like 90%, then yeah, that's something that should be pointed out as a data point. You can't ignore it. Agreed.
No, that's big. That is huge. Yeah. And part of this is the conversation that tends to happen when people talk about this stuff. And so so often I don't want to just repeat talking points, but we're humans. We exist in a society that tends to do that kind of thing. We do that kind of thing. If drugs aren't the answer, then what is? If it's personal relationships, forget changing society, because that's a much larger conversation. If you could solve this stuff by personally, either therapeutically or having a functional community on a basic level that could help people with these things, then I think you would need drugs far less. And I wish that we had that kind of world. I wish that we lived in that kind of world. I think we've lost a lot of that stuff. That's a topic for some other day. That could be its own full show. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will be back tomorrow, folks. Signing off. Fault Lines. See you on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Shane made a damn good point at the end of that. He was trying to close. He was like, gotta get the point. He was trying to get it in just before it closes, because it's a hard close. Like, sometimes when we're like shutting down calls or something like that, it's because we have a hard limit. And when we're getting up to the hour, like the 8 o'clock hour, the 9 o'clock hour, there is no leeway. Like, if we're having a conversation with somebody at 7:45, I can push that. If that person is answering really good, I can push that. I will push that. Even if it goes into somebody else's thing, I will do it just because I kind of want the person to finish their thought. If it is coming up and it gets the break, the person could be giving me the word of God, and I am going to cut that off because my engineer says so. So that's kind of the way that stuff works. Great show today. And, it's wild. We didn't have a guest for 7:45, but when we don't have a guest for 7:45 and it's an open segment, my mind goes to UFOs. Now, the only reason, though, the only reason that's partially true, 75% true, is because in today's situation, we ran into a situation where we couldn't get a guest for 7:45. And there was just an article that came out by Maria Bartiromo, who is feeling herself on the UFO issue because of all of the publicity she got for the Dan Ratcliffe interview. So she came up with, talk to Marco Rubio. Let's get into these UFOs, Rubio. You talked about it before. Talk about it now. And so it came up. So my thought was, that is in the news. Maria Bartiromo had just talked about it with Ratcliffe. She's talking about it with Rubio. And the article came out from Debrief talking about the UFOs around our ships. Perfect timing. So, guys, I want to thank you guys for joining us. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. And I'm going to go and yell at my Wi-Fi service. Thanks all. I'll talk to you later this evening.